Number 10. Lauren Showers. In September of 2019, Lauren Showers, aged 19, was part of a team handling a rehabilitation job on a highway bridge outside of Wilsall, Montana. He was driving a forklift on the bridge when cars started passing him illegally through the traffic lights. The single lane had become narrower, and as another vehicle drove past Showers, he turned too close to the edge of the bridge. The street started crumbling beneath the forklift. The teenager tried to jump out, but his leg got caught in the seatbelt, leaving him to dangle from the machine as it tumbled 50 feet down a steep hill. The forklift rolled 3 times, and even though Showers had desperately tried to stay on top, he was eventually thrown from it, coming to a stop at the bottom of the hill. Then the forklift fell on top of him, crushing his body. The teenager was conscious throughout his entire ordeal and felt as the massive machine landed on his hips and right forearm. Parts of his body basically exploded under the weight, and he remembered seeing a separated piece of his arm muscle lying on the ground next to him. Miraculously, Showers survived. The dirt on which he landed had recently been moved by the construction team, meaning that it was soft and helped absorb some of the impact. Had it been hard, the young man would have bled out before the air ambulance could get to him. Showers was taken to a hospital and placed on life support. He'd lost his right arm below the elbow, and his pelvis had been completely shattered. Showers eventually had to make the difficult but ultimately life-saving decision of having a hemicorporectomy surgery. Everything below his waist was amputated. Showers didn't think he'd survive, as his health would take sporadic turns for the worst. He and his girlfriend, Sabia Reich, whom he'd been dating for 18 months, said their final goodbyes several times during his first month of hospitalization. However, after he was transferred back to a Montana hospital, he recovered at an incredibly fast rate and was eventually sent home. Showers adapted to his new life, which involved a wheelchair and a series of prosthetics. Reich stood by his side, and they eventually got engaged. Number 9. Brandon Lee Van Dyke. In May of 2020, police in Phoenix City, Alabama, responded to a call at a lumber yard after one of the workers suffered a gruesome wood chipper accident. Brandon Lee Van Dyke, age 34, had gone to Phoenix Lumber Company after the machine had become jammed. He was in the process of clearing the blockage shortly before 5 a.m. when he got tangled and pulled inside. The wood chipper's blades wrought havoc on his body, ripping out chunks of bone and muscle tissue. When first responders arrived at the lumber yard, they found his partial remains by the machine. A representative from the county's coroner office pronounced Van Dyke dead at the scene. Number 8. Paige Taylor Council. Shortly before Christmas 2020, Australian woman Paige Taylor Council suffered fatal injuries after she was struck by heavy machinery at the mine where she worked. 6 months prior to the incident, Council had started working at the Big Bell gold mine in Western Australia. Following a career shift from the childcare industry, the 25-year-old family claimed that she was happy at her new job as she was following in the footsteps of her father, who had also been a gold miner. On December the 14th, Council was hit by a truck while working in the underground tunnels. Emergency responders treated her at the scene before she was flown to a Perth hospital in critical condition. Council passed away roughly 6 hours after the accident. The incident marked the 3rd death to be recorded by Western Australia's mining industry in 2020. In January, a man had suffered a fatal accident at the Roy Hill iron ore mine, while in January, another worker died when his machine fell over 80 feet down an open stope. Number 7. Luana Dorazio. In early May of 2021, a young woman was crushed at a textile factory in the province of Prato, Italy. 22-year-old Luana Dorazio was working on a warper, a machine that sorts out the threads, weaves, and sews. The full dynamics of the accident are, as of now, unclear, as the investigation is ongoing. It remains to be established if human negligence, malfunction, or a combination of both had occurred. Preliminary findings seem to suggest that a protective shutter intended to prevent accidents had been removed. Dorazio, who'd been working at the textile factory for about a year, got caught in the machine and was sucked into the roller. By the time her colleagues tried to intervene, she'd already been torn apart by the warper. Dorazio was pronounced dead at the scene. It's been reported that she was survived by a 5-year-old son. In the aftermath, street artist Jorit created a mural of Dorazio in Rome to simultaneously honor her memory and raise awareness of companies that put profit above the safety of their workers. Number 6. Vali Jardu. In 2021, shortly after 8 a.m., the police were called to a tyre repair business in North Adelaide, Australia, following a brutal workplace accident. 35-year-old Vali Jardu, who'd recently become a father for the 6th time, had been fatally crushed by a tyre pressing machine. In the accident's aftermath, the Liberian community of which he was a part showed their support to Jardu's widow and their children. According to the grieving woman, the passing of her husband had been the second workplace tragedy that the family had experienced over the course of 6 months. In November, a cousin was killed in a truck crash in the Adelaide Hills. The incident resulted in manslaughter charges for the man's employers after it was revealed that many of their trucks had had severe maintenance deficiencies. Number 5. Brendan Stokes. While out on a service call on June the 29th of 2018, a Canadian man was killed in the neighborhood of Dallas, Kamloops. 19-year-old Brendan Stokes was cleaning the wheel hub on a loader that was suspended by a hydraulic jack. It was reported that the vehicle abruptly slipped off the jack and fell on Stokes, inflicting deadly crushing injuries. British Columbia's workplace safety authorities found that the blame rested with Stokes' employer, Kamloops Tirecraft. They'd reportedly failed to service the loader in accordance to the manufacturer's instructions and to ensure the jack was used properly. The company also hadn't provided their workers with the adequate information, training, or safety guidelines. For all these violations, Kamloops Tirecraft was fined a little over $8,400. After the decision was revealed, a petition was launched demanding stricter accountability and harsher penalties as a result of Stokes' death. His mother referred to the fine as a smack in the face. Number 4. Ian Ebbs. In 2008, a maintenance worker at a publishing plant in Peterborough, England, was fatally crushed by the industrial press on which he'd been performing a routine check. 43-year-old Ian Ebbs was halfway through the night shift at St. Ives Webb. Ebbs, the father of 2 teenagers, accidentally fell into the press as he was performing maintenance work. Colleagues frantically rushed to his help and were ultimately successful in pulling him out of the machinery. By that time, however, he'd already sustained devastating internal injuries to which he succumbed only hours later in a local hospital. The plant was cleared by the health and safety executive to resume its activity, but the press in question was decommissioned pending an investigation. Number 3. Dean Reed. In May of 2015, Western Australian man Dean Reed broke nearly every bone in his hands and needed to have a toe replace one of his thumbs after a horrific workplace accident. He was operating a machine that flattened plastics through rollers. It was known that the safety feature on the rollers wasn't working properly, but nonetheless, Reed was required to use the machine. It's also worth mentioning that at the time he was a trainee line operator. His hands got sucked into the rollers and were brutally crushed. Looking back on the accident, Reed remembered, "I could feel every bone break, every finger getting crushed, and I couldn't get my hands out." He could hear the crunching sounds of his bones being mangled by the rollers. There wasn't much blood once he was finally freed, but he also couldn't move his hands at all. He had multiple surgeries in the aftermath, looking to partially restore them. Both his ring fingers were amputated, and in one operation, his big toe was transplanted to replace his right-hand thumb. The incident subsequently became the subject of a workplace health and safety investigation. Today's topic was requested by Mido the Don, Galaxy Magician, and Romella Carme. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Edgardo Echevarria. In January of 2010, Edgardo Echevarria was working for Future Foam Carpet Cushion in Orlando, Florida. On the 13th, his supervisors asked him to remove the foam core from a peeler machine that was used to cut blocks of foam. 44-year-old Echevarria was not trained in operating that specific piece of equipment. By removing the core, the machine was activated, as Echevarria was within range. A surgically sharp blade cut through his pelvis, removing his genitalia. Echevarria was left in critical condition and subsequently sued the company once it emerged that the employees had removed a protective guard from the peeler. The suit alleged that he was virtually cut in half, and aside from negligence claims, Echevarria also sought punitive damages for medical expenses disfigurement, and loss of enjoyment of life. Number 1. Hugo Avalos Shannon. In 2013, a southeast Portland man died from what was reported as blunt force injuries and chopping wounds after falling in an industrial blender at a meat processing plant. 41-year-old Hugo Avalos Shannon was working for DCS Sanitation Management Inc., which had been contracted to routinely perform the cleaning of equipment at interstate meat distributors. The latter company had a relatively poor track record. In 2003, it had unwittingly distributed ground beef from a cow afflicted by bovine spongiform encephalopathy, commonly known as mad cow disease. In 2007, it was the target of a consumer alert when E. coli bacteria was traced back to its ground beef. Avalos Shannon's accident occurred in late April. Shortly before midnight, paramedics were called to the scene after he was found entangled in the blender. He was pronounced dead at the scene, and the following day, firefighters dismantled the blender so that they could remove his remains. An investigation later found that machinery in the meat grounding room hadn't been properly locked up, meaning that it was susceptible to unexpectedly start functioning. In light of these findings, the victim's family sued the company for $5 million. Number 8. Bismarck, Espinoza, Martinez. In November of 2018, Florida woman Carla Stefaniak was visiting Costa Rica to celebrate her 36th birthday. The day before she was due to return on the 27th, she disappeared from the Airbnb where she'd been staying in Escazú. She'd messaged friends that it was pretty sketchy at her resort, as there was heavy rain and no power, adding that she might ask a security guard to get her a water bottle. Stefaniak's friends and family raised the alarm after they'd lost contact with the woman, who typically share the events of her holiday with them, and on social media. Police dogs later found her body several hundred feet from the Villa Lemas complex, half naked, wrapped in plastic and partially buried. She had died from stab wounds and blunt force trauma to the head. 32-year-old security guard Bismarck Espinoza Martinez was arrested after he'd contradicted himself in the statements given to the police. He'd claimed to have last seen Stefaniak at around 5 a.m. when he'd allegedly helped her load her luggage into a taxi, heading for the airport. It was an odd report, particularly since Stefaniak's flight was in the afternoon. Investigators concluded that Martinez had used his position to enter Stefaniak's room, where he tried to abuse her and then killed her when she fought back. The security guard, reported as an illegal immigrant from Nicaragua, then moved the body to a different area and buried it. Martinez was ultimately sentenced to 16 years in prison and ordered to pay Stefaniak's family over $50,000. The victim's relatives were outraged by this decision, as they wanted a maximum sentence of 50 years. Number 7. Incident at Manchester Victoria Station. In October of 2016, a factory worker was caught smoking at Manchester Victoria Station in England and was chased by 4 security guards for an estimated 9 minutes. Harrowing body cam footage would show the guards restraining and pinning 27-year-old Jack Barnes to the ground. Pressure was applied to his neck, and Barnes said that he couldn't breathe a total of 7 times. One of the security guards was recorded uttering, "I'll tell you what, I'll just put him out." Barnes suffered a cardiac arrest, and the restraint continued for a few minutes before anyone checked his condition. He was taken to a hospital but never regained consciousness, and was pronounced dead several weeks later. The evidence was initially considered insufficient for manslaughter charges, but a coroner would subsequently rule his killing unlawful, prompting the launch of another inquest. It was argued that Paul Fogarty, Brian Gartside, Matthew Sellers, and Stephen Rowlands had used excessive and unreasonable force in restraining Barnes. They never expressed any remorse for their actions, in spite of the fact that a walk-away policy was in place, and they were never allowed to chase down Barnes in the first place. Synthetic cannabinoids were found in the victim's system but weren't believed to have contributed to his death, as it was mainly attributed to the violence he'd experienced at the hands of the guards. Number 6. Stephen Michael Duxbury. In October of 2015, a security guard at an apartment complex in Orlando, Florida, was arrested for the first-degree murder and assault of a resident. 27-year-old Sasha Samsudin had returned to her Uptown Place home following a night of drinking with friends. CCTV cameras captured her at around 1:45 a.m. in the company of 33-year-old Stephen Michael Duxbury, the building's only security guard. According to police documents, the footage showed her bumping into walls, apparently intoxicated. The following day, officers performed a welfare check after Samsudin's worried friends had failed to reach her. The police found her lifeless body curled up in a blanket on her bed. The young woman had been strangled to death. Her blouse was ripped apart and there was a condom wrapper nearby. Her underwear and purse were missing. In the aftermath, Duxbury was questioned by the police but said he'd never been to her apartment and had merely tried to help Samsudin find her keys. He gave the officers a story about a mystery man whom he'd allegedly seen pursuing her, but the evidence against him began to pile up. The day after Samsudin's body was found, he had bite marks and fresh injuries on his forearms. The police picked up Duxbury's fingerprint from the toilet seat in Samsudin's bathroom, and footprints on the floor of the crime scene matched shoes recovered from his home. Duxbury's phone records showed searches about ways of getting around the keypad lock model on her apartment door. It became evident that instead of protecting Samsudin, as was his job, Duxbury had broken into her home, abused, and then killed her. It took a jury just 4 hours to find him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Number 5. Franz Arestil. In August of 2021, an NYU security guard was charged with attempted murder after attacking his supervisor with a machete-like weapon. 38-year-old Franz Arestil and his victim, who was only identified as a 48-year-old man, were arguing about the mandatory screening process in effect at the university. The daily screener is a set of questions on a smartphone app which needed to be completed in order to be allowed access to NYU buildings. It was only available to vaccinated people or those with proof of a negative COVID-19 test. Arestil had to be sent home earlier in the week after refusing to undergo the screening process. Following the argument, which occurred on July the 24th at around 1 a.m., Arestil repeatedly struck the victim with the large knife. Surveillance footage showed him running for his life out of the Broome Street residence hall, with Arestil in pursuit. At the time, there were no students present. The victim survived but required extensive surgery after being left with a collapsed lung and several broken ribs. Arestil, a past recipient of NYU's Service Award for his 15 years as a public safety employee, was released on bail pending his next court appearance. Number 4. Robert Pavel. In February of 2020, a woman was killed at Timberland's headquarters in Stratham, New Hampshire. The attacker was identified as 20-year-old security guard Robert Pavel. In the aftermath, he was charged with both first-degree and second-degree murder in the death of marketing director Catherine Hepner, aged 46. The first charge stemmed from Pavel stabbing Hepner, either before, during, or after abusing her, and the second-degree charge was for him recklessly causing her death while manifesting extreme indifference to the value of human life. Pavel pled not guilty and was held without bail. A lawsuit that Hepner's husband subsequently initiated against Securitas, the security guard's employer, claimed that he'd been hired negligently and that there'd been clear red flags which weren't addressed. They included Pavel using marijuana and psychedelic drugs at work, as well as him allegedly suffering mental breakdowns that went unreported by his supervisor. Securitas denied responsibility, but the case is ongoing. Number 3. Clive Carter. In November of 2012, in a horrific fit of rage, security guard Clive Carter beat a medical conference delegate to death with a fire extinguisher. Thai woman Kanakporn Satchawat was meant to attend an HIV drug therapy conference at Glasgow's Clyde Auditorium over a 5-day period. She was booked at the Marriott and had previously written on Facebook how excited she was to visit Scotland. 35-year-old Carter was working security at the conference. Satchawat had reportedly complained about repeatedly being asked to show him her conference ID pass. This enraged Carter, who by his own account heard the words "die, just die" in his head while arguing with Satchawat. The 6'5" security guard followed the pharmaceutical manager, who weighed less than 100 pounds, into the women's bathroom. It was there that he repeatedly struck her with a fire extinguisher so hard that every bone on the left side of her face and neck was broken and her skull was shattered to pieces. 2 French doctors would later find Sajawat unresponsive, lying in a pool of her own blood. After the attack, Carter hid his blood-stained blazer and cleaned the fire extinguisher. He then went to the staff room and calmly ate the sandwiches he'd bought for lunch. Following his arrest, Carter claimed he had no memory of the events after their argument and that, as a borderline personality disorder sufferer, he wasn't responsible for his actions. It was later revealed that he'd harbored an obsession for fire extinguishers and even had a photo of one on his computer. 8 days before killing Sajawat, he was working security at a Holiday Inn Express on Stockwell Street. Stephanie O'Brien, aged 24, was staying with 3 friends at the hotel. Carter knocked on their door with the fire extinguisher, claiming he was there to put out a fire. O'Brien fortunately managed to close and lock the door on him. For the brutal killing of Sajawat, Carter was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years served. Today's topic was requested by Prangon G Loves Pokemon. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Christopher Emmons. In June of 2018, on the south side of Chicago, a liquor store security guard fatally injured a suspected shoplifter. While reviewing surveillance footage, 57-year-old Christopher Emmons noticed a man stealing a bottle from the store. He would later be identified as 33-year-old Herbert Lemon. The next time that he visited the store, Emmons put on a pair of gloves and locked the door. As Lemon approached the counter with a beer bottle, Emmons punched him in the face twice without warning. The security cameras, which also had audio capabilities, recorded no verbal exchange between the men. Emmons dragged Lemon outside of the camera's view and continued to beat him. He then helped him to his feet, only to strike him a few more times. When officers arrived at the scene, Lemon claimed that he didn't want to press charges. A few hours later, his girlfriend found him unresponsive at his home. He was rushed to the hospital with brain hemorrhage and underwent emergency surgery. After the operation, doctors observed no sign of brain activity and Lemon was pulled off life support. The ruling of the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office was homicide from the multiple blows to the head that he'd sustained. Emmons was charged with murder. It wasn't the first charge of its kind that he'd faced. Prior to being hired as a security guard, he'd spent 23 years in prison for murder, and his record also featured convictions for unlawful use of a weapon as well as arson. Number 1. Steve Bouquet. From October of 2018 to June of 2019, shopping center security guard Steve Bouquet stabbed at least 16 pet cats in the seaside resort city of Brighton, England. The affected owners were left heartbroken upon finding their beloved pets bleeding in the street. Bouquet, an ex-Navy gunner in his early 50s, killed 9 of the felines and maimed 7 others during his campaign of cruelty, although it's believed he may have been responsible for many other attacks. The police spent months searching for the faceless and nameless killer who terrorized Brighton residents, leaving them fearful for the safety of their pets. The break in the case came from footage captured by a CCTV camera, which a homeowner had set up to monitor the alleyway outside his house. The footage showed Bouquet stopping to pet Hendrix, a 9-month-old black kitten belonging to the homeowner. Bouquet pulled something from his rucksack and made sudden jerks forward, causing Hendrix to flee. The pet later died from his injuries. After the police arrested the security guard, they tied him to other crimes based on cell phone location data. Additionally, photos of the cats were found on his phone and feline DNA was discovered on the blade of a knife in his home. In court, Bouquet claimed that he wasn't a threat to animals, as owners expressed the pain they'd felt from losing their pets or seeing them suffer. No reason was provided for what one prosecutor dubbed an unusual and extremely traumatic offense. Bouquet, dubbed the Brighton cat killer, was sentenced to over 5 years in jail. Number 8. Melissa Goodwin. From November of 2019 to April of 2020, corrections officer Melissa Goodwin was involved in a romantic relationship with inmate Corey London at the Metropolitan Remand and Reception Centre in Sydney. Their tryst began shortly after London, who was serving time for armed robbery, had been transferred to the prison. The pair spoke on the phone via a third party and also secretly over the prison intercom. The extent of the physical exchanges between bodybuilding enthusiast Goodwin and the inmate remain unclear. 4 days after he was transferred from the prison where she worked, Goodwin wrote him a letter in purple, his favorite color. In it, She expressed her hopes for their future, but also wrote about the risks she was taking by getting involved with him. They maintained their relationship, but Goodwin then started seeing former inmate, aspiring rapper, and associate of the Rebels Motorcycle Club, Caleb Valeri. The budding romance gained media attention, and news of it reached 21-year-old London. He gave further evidence about their relationship while enraged during a phone conversation with his mother. Goodwin ultimately admitted that they'd been boyfriend and girlfriend, but claimed their exchanges were more on a pen pal level. She vehemently denied allegations that she'd performed explicit acts on him in a storeroom a total of 5 times, as London himself had stated earlier. However, when it came time to testify against his ex, London categorically refused to do so, even with the risk of time added to his sentence. He cited a fear for his safety, presumably from members of the rebels. Since there was no conclusive proof that intercourse had occurred, Goodwin avoided jail time. She pled guilty to having a relationship with an inmate, and other allegations against her, like smuggling tobacco, cigarette lighters, and gum for London, were dropped. She was given a 12-month community corrections order as well as 120 hours of community service. Number 7. Alex Banter, Todd Scheffler, and Willie Hedden. In May of 2018, at the Western Illinois Correctional Center in Mount Sterling, an inmate was severely beaten by 3 of the prison guards in what was subsequently deemed an unprovoked attack. 65-year-old Larry Irvin was airlifted from the prison with a punctured colon, broken ribs, and other serious internal injuries. He needed surgery to remove a section of his bowel in the aftermath of the attack. Irvin passed away several weeks after the incident, and his death was ruled a homicide from blunt force trauma. Guards Alex Banter, Todd Scheffler, and Willie Hedden were charged in the aftermath. They'd moved Irvin to a segregation unit, where they brutally beat him while he was handcuffed behind the back, and posed no threat to them. Banter and Scheffler pled not guilty to charges of conspiracy to deprive of civil rights, deprivation of civil rights, obstruction of an investigation, falsification of documents, and misleading conduct. 42-year-old Hedden entered a guilty plea and agreed to cooperate in exchange for lesser charges. Even so, the 2 counts of civil rights violations, which he admitted to, could see him sentenced to life in prison and fines of $250,000 each. The trial is ongoing. Number 6. Tina Gonzalez. In 2021, a former corrections officer at the Fresno County Jail in California was jailed for 7 months for engaging in an intimate relationship with an inmate. The identity of her lover wasn't released, while Assistant Sheriff Steve McComas, one of Gonzalez's superiors, described her actions as the product of a depraved mind. It was reported that the woman, who was in her mid-20s, cut a hole in her uniform so that it would be easier for her to have intercourse with an inmate, in full view of at least 11 other detainees. She had worked at the jail from 2016 to 2019, and following a tip, staff launched an investigation into her activity. In addition to being intimate with the inmate, she'd also endangered the lives of her colleagues by allegedly supplying him with razor blades, which can be used as a weapon in prison. Gonzalez had also provided him with a cell phone and informed him about cell inspections so that he could hide contraband. Even though she'd violated her oath and ruined her career, according to McComas, Gonzalez showed no remorse after being caught and continued to engage in explicit phone calls with the inmate, boasting about the crimes she'd carried out. Number 5. Erica Whittingham. In 2021, a former corrections officer was sentenced to 3 years in prison for getting involved with an inmate and helping him escape. Following the breakdown of her 11-year-long marriage, Erica Whittingham fell for violent robber Michael Sodden, her lawyer later arguing that she was smitten with him. Sodden was considered too dangerous for public release, having been sentenced as part of a gang that tied and beat up a 78-year-old man at his Dorset farm in 2011. Sodden and Whittingham met while she was a custody officer at HMP Dovegate in Staffordshire between 2017 and 2019. They developed a romantic relationship which continued even after Sodden was transferred to HMP Sudbury. To communicate, he used a contraband cell phone, and she talked on a burner phone. On October the 1st of 2019, Sodden escaped by scaling the prison's fence and then fleeing in the car that had been waiting for him, with Whittingham acting as the getaway driver. They remained in contact and met roughly 8 times in various areas of the country while Sodden was on the run, with Whittingham paying for hotels, accommodation, and other items that he needed while evading the authorities. Then from January to March of 2020, in the second part of his 6 months of freedom, Sutton started seeing another woman in the Bournemouth region. He was eventually arrested on March the 27th. Whittingham pled guilty to harboring an escaped prisoner and misconduct in public office, while Sutton had 6 months added to his sentence for the escape. Number 4. Gladiator Fights at California State Prison. In 2019, relatives of inmates at the California State Prison in Corcoran protested outside the facility for the extensive violence that their loved ones were allegedly forced to face while incarcerated. The main aggressors were members of the Fresno Bulldogs, who'd failed to uphold a truce and started attacking their rivals in the yard roughly a year prior. This caused 350 inmates to be placed on a modified program that restricted visitations and exercise time. Inmates' rights organization, the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, alleged that the guards were putting on gladiator fights by purposefully releasing rival gang members in the yard at the same time. They anticipated that the groups would brawl and thus could use their fighting as a justification for the continuation of the modified program. One of the protesters, who hadn't seen her husband in months, argued that the guards liked to see bloodshed, while the state's Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation denied that guards were setting inmates up to brawl. There have been past reports of gladiator fights at Corcoran. In 2000, 8 guards were acquitted of similar charges after they'd been brought to trial in an FBI investigation. It was reported that they'd encourage prisoners to fight, only to sometimes end them by firing deadly shots. There were rumors of an extensive cover-up and silenced whistleblowers, but the acquittals were upheld. A few years prior, state legislative hearings underlined the brutality of Corcoran, while an independent panel found that nearly 80% of the shootings were unjustified occurrences, which the state never fully investigated. Number 3. Tashina Majors. In 2020, a senior officer at Northern State Prison in Newark, New Jersey, was charged with second-degree assault for being romantically involved with an inmate. From November of 2019 to December of 2020, Tashina Majors had been bedding an inmate over whom, by virtue of her status, she had authority and disciplinary power. 42-year-old Majors' alleged misconduct was uncovered following a joint investigation by the Attorney General's Office of Public Integrity and Accountability and the New Jersey Department of Corrections Special Investigations Division. Majors had yet to comment on the allegations, but she took down her Facebook in the scandal's aftermath. If found guilty on the assault charge, she risked a fine of up to $150,000 as well as 5 to 10 years in a state prison. Today's topic was requested by Deb Pearson and the JMall88. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Ralph Kepler. In December of 2016, Teresa Keel was found nearly bludgeoned to death near her home in Long Beach, New York State. 56-year-old Keel had been repeatedly struck in the face with a metal barbell, which resulted in her losing an eye and suffering broken teeth, as well as a partially collapsed skull. Keel was left in a vegetative state due to irreparable brain damage and died roughly 2 years later. Whoever had brutally attacked her was effective in covering their tracks. Intense investigative work by Long Beach and Nassau County Police Departments ultimately pointed to Keel's own daughter, Francesca, and her boyfriend, Ralph Kepler, as the ones behind the murder. Kepler, a corrections officer at Rikers Island, and his family had invested in a dating app developed by Keel and her son. A business dispute had been suspected as the main reason behind the killing, with Kepler feeling that Keel had squandered his investment and demanding his money back. Francesca, then in her late teens, aided her boyfriend in carrying out the attack on her mother. She installed a GPS tracker on Keel's car with email alerts informing her when the vehicle was close to her home or workplace. Kepler stalked the woman and ambushed her in the entrance corridor to her apartment complex, unleashing the savage attack that eventually ended her life. Francesca called a taxi that picked Kepler up from the scene of the crime. The police arrested him at Rikers Island, where his employment was promptly terminated. He was sentenced to 22 years after pleading guilty to second-degree murder, second-degree conspiracy, and related charges. while Francesca entered a guilty plea for second-degree manslaughter and was given a 13-year sentence. Number 1. Nancy Gonzalez. In January of 2007, Ronell Wilson became the first man to be sentenced to death by a federal jury in New York since the capital punishment had been reinstated in 1988. During a gun deal gone wrong a few years prior, Wilson, an alleged member of the Stapleton Crew street gang, executed 2 undercover NYPD detectives, searched their bodies and stole their car. When his death sentence was pronounced, the victims' families and other members of the police force responded with applause and cheers, to which he reportedly reacted by sticking his tongue out at them. In 2010, his death sentence was vacated on appeal due to a legal technicality, and he was moved to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. It was there that in July of 2012 he had relations with prison guard Nancy Gonzalez, who was then in her late 20s. The consensual and illicit rendezvous had taken place in a staff bathroom. She became pregnant with Wilson's child and in 2013 gave birth to a son who they named Justice. After the tryst surfaced, Gonzalez lost the custody battle and the child was placed in foster care with her maternal aunt. At her trial, Gonzalez's defense lawyer argued that she'd been abused in her younger years and while serving in the military, which resulted in emotional instability, causing her to seek destructive relationships. She was reportedly involved with another inmate who wasn't named when she met Wilson. Gonzalez was ultimately sentenced to 1 year in prison. Prosecutors argued that Wilson had targeted and impregnated her in order to avoid ending up on death row again. He was nevertheless sentenced to death again before it was ultimately commuted to life without parole on the grounds that he was intellectually disabled, which made him ineligible for execution under the 8th Amendment. Number 8. DeSean Stewart. On December the 23rd of 2017, DeSean Stewart, aged 24, was scheduled to walk his mail route in Columbus, Ohio. At the time, he was pending dismissal from his job with the U.S. Postal Service. Instead of doing his rounds, he went to see his supervisor, 52-year-old Lance Dempsey, at an office in suburban Dublin. Stewart was reportedly naked when he approached Dempsey in the sorting bay and shot him with a handgun. The postal worker then drove to Ginger Ballard's apartment complex at Boland Place. The 53-year-old woman was believed to have also been involved in Stewart's pending dismissal, particularly with investigating him under suspicions of misconduct. At around 7:15 a.m., police received a call about an attacker with a gun chasing a woman outside the apartment complex. When officers arrived at the scene, they arrested Stewart and recovered a handgun he'd thrown while trying to run away. Ballard's lifeless body was found lying between 2 vehicles. The ensuing investigation found the woman had died instantly from blunt force trauma to the head after being thrown to the ground. In May 2018, Stewart was indicted on federal charges with 2 counts of murdering an officer of the United States. Investigators determined the attack to have been carried out in retaliation for the pending termination of his employment. Although he could have been put to death, Stewart was found not guilty in September of 2019 after multiple mental health experts determined he'd suffered manic and psychotic episodes at the time of the crimes. Upon being arrested, the postal worker had allegedly told officers that God had told him to kill his supervisors. According to documents, he also spat out 2 pieces of Ballard's jewelry, claiming they were being used to suck out his soul. Number 7. Adrian Jackson. On December the 28th of 2019, postal worker Adrian Jackson, aged 30, was delivering mail on Cedardale Street in Houston, Texas, when he was randomly shot by a man driving a black Honda. His attacker, a Caucasian male later described by witnesses as having tattoos on his face, neck, and arms, fled the scene, only to attempt to shoot another man at a nearby gas station minutes later. His gun misfired, so he fled once more and rear-ended a woman's car while making his escape. In the shooting's immediate aftermath, Jackson screamed for help and was taken to a local hospital, where doctors found bullet wounds to his back and lower abdomen. His condition was later pronounced as stable. Jackson's attacker was later tracked by a photo a witness had taken of his car and identified as 24-year-old Matthew Williams. He was charged with aggravated assault against a public servant, aggravated assault with a lethal weapon, burglary of a motor vehicle, breach of a protective order, and attack of a federal employee. Investigators also found that Williams was a member of the Aryan Brotherhood gang, but it was unclear how his criminal connections had factored into his rampage. It was also reported that he was under the influence of drugs at the time of the shooting. Number 6. Jason Schaefer. 33-year-old Jason Schaefer was shot dead on October the 13th of 2021 while delivering mail on his daily route in Longmont, Colorado. Witnesses reported to have seen a person wearing a dark hoodie and a blue mask fleeing the area. The emergency services were called and Schaefer was pronounced dead. When the postmaster arrived at the scene, he reportedly asked if the shooter could have been Schaefer's former partner and mother of his children, 26-year-old Devon Schreiner. The two had worked together at the post office, but Schreiner's employment had been terminated roughly 2 weeks before the shooting after an unspecified incident between them. They'd also been involved in a custody battle for their 2 children, and investigators found that Schreiner had threatened Schaefer in the past. On the night of the attack, police arrested a 26-year-old woman on suspicion of first-degree murder. Schreiner appeared in court on October the 19th, where it was revealed she'd been plotting the shooting along with 34-year-old federal prison employee Andrew Ritchie. At first, the woman denied the existence of a romantic relationship with Ritchie, but later admitted they'd been seeing each other in light of telling evidence that had surfaced in the trial. Ritchie was charged as an accomplice and told detectives he'd tried to convince Schreiner on multiple occasions to not go through with the plan. However, on the morning of October the 13th, as he was dropping her off at her new job, Schreiner allegedly told him that today is the day. GPS from both of their phones and cameras from houses in the vicinity showed that Ritchie's vehicle had followed Schaefer's along his delivery route. Police also uncovered a 1911 handgun in the console of the man's car. The alleged killer's trials are currently ongoing and each face lengthy prison sentences if convicted. Number 5. Robert Rochester. Robert Rochester was doing his usual rounds on his Stanton, Delaware collection route on October the 11th of 2012 when a German Shepherd escaped its owner's property, ran towards him and started biting into his body. The dog mauled Rochester's legs, arm and stomach before being dragged off him by a passing motorist. She then pulled the postal worker into her vehicle and took him to the hospital. The German Shepherd went on to attack a smaller canine as it was being walked by its owner, and the police were consequently called. When a trooper arrived at the scene, he fired his service weapon 3 times, injuring the aggressive animal. The German Shepherd survived and was placed in quarantine at a veterinary clinic to determine if it had rabies or another condition to explain its violent behavior. 55-year-old Rochester was kept overnight in the hospital for treatment and released the following day. A week later, on October the 18th, he went into cardiac arrest at his home in Newcastle and was rushed to the hospital. Doctors were unable to save him, and he was declared dead at around 2 a.m. Rochester's death certificate listed his cause of death as pulmonary embolism and temporary disability due to work injuries stemming from the dog attack. Number 4. Graeme Bennett. On July the 15th of 2013, due to a shortage in staff at the Royal Mail in Lincoln, England, 47-year-old Graeme Bennett had to go out and make postal deliveries, despite his job being in the sorting office. His managers assigned him to delivery that day as one of his colleagues was having some time off. Temperatures in the area had risen to 81 degrees Fahrenheit while Bennett was out working the route. He was about halfway through his deliveries when he stopped to rest in the shade, next to a block of flats. Residents subsequently found him keeled over in a small patch of shade by the entrance and tried to resuscitate him while calling the emergency services. Paramedics took Bennett to the hospital, but he died a short time later from a reported heat-related health issue. Number 3. Graeme Ellison. In September 2019, Royal Mail postman Graeme Ellison, aged 59, was driving his Peugeot van in Cumbria, England, along the A683. He was going to collect mail from a postbox when he encountered a horse and carriage. He slowly overtook it, but instead of going back in his lane, Ellison remained on the wrong lane as he approached a blind bend, with the intention of pulling into a lay-by. 27-year-old Oliver Evans, a police officer off duty, was traveling on his motorbike and came around the blind bend in the direct path of Ellison's van. He tried braking, but was unable to avoid the collision. Evans was thrown off his bike and suffered severe head and spine injuries. Several passers-by and even Ellison himself made efforts to save him, but paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. In court, the former postman admitted to causing death by careless driving and was jailed for 32 weeks in June 2021. He was to be banned from driving for 2 years upon his release. Today's topic was requested by Elisha Garcia, Matt Clemens, Spunducky Wubu, and Suzanne Schneider. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Grant Gallagher. In April of 2006, 41-year-old Oregon letter carrier Grant Gallagher heard about his supervisor's decision to add extra mail to his delivery route. He had been working on a new mail route for 3 weeks, and he'd reportedly felt pressured by a week-long scrutiny of his work to which his supervisors had subjected him. On April the 4th, he was allegedly ahead of schedule when his supervisor assigned him more mail to deliver. Enraged by this development, he went to the Baker City Post looking for the postmaster, Michael McGuire. On his way, he encountered his supervisor, 49-year-old Lori Hayes Cotter, in the parking lot. He repeatedly ran her over with his postal vehicle, seriously injuring her. Gallagher then got out of his car holding a .357 Magnum revolver and entered the building looking for McGuire. When he couldn't find him, he returned to the parking lot and shot Hayes Cotter several times, killing her. In a visible frenzy, he also fired rounds at her car, according to a witness, and then threw his gun towards a river nearby. A police officer arrived immediately after the shooting, and Gallagher walked up to him and surrendered. He was arrested and charged with the intentional murder of Lori Hayes Cotter and the attempted aggravated murder of the postmaster. In July of 2006, Gallagher pleaded guilty and was sentenced to at least 35 years in prison. Number 1. Louis Vignone. On October the 7th of 2021, while on his rounds along Columbia Avenue in Davenport, Iowa, 58-year-old Louis Vignone was shot dead. The gunman was his former neighbor, 53-year-old Eric Quartz, who later confessed to the killing. He'd driven up and stopped his car in front of Vignone's USPS vehicle to block him. Quartz then got out of his car and proceeded to shoot at the postal worker several times. After Vignone had collapsed to the ground, Quartz dropped the murder weapon, entered his vehicle, and drove to the Carnegie Borough Police Department, where he surrendered to the authorities. A contractor working on a house nearby had heard the gunshots and rushed to help Vignone, but to no avail. He was declared dead at the scene after sustaining multiple gun wounds, including some to his head. In his confession, Quartz told the police he and Vignone used to be neighbors in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and that he believed the postman had poisoned him and his family with cyanide when they lived close to each other. Another neighbor of theirs stated Quartz had told them something big was going to happen and that the whole city would hear about it. After appearing in court virtually, Quartz faced charges of killing a federal employee, for which he could ultimately be given the death penalty. Number 6. Latosha Shunta Daniels. At about 9:30 p.m. on April the 4th of 2019, Arkansas woman Latosha Shunta Daniels arrived at an apartment in Collierville, Tennessee, belonging to Broads and Tabitha Perry. The latter, who was home alone at the time, allowed 39-year-old Daniels, whom she and her husband had known when they lived in Little Rock, inside. The two women talked until Broads, the pastor at Mississippi Boulevard Christian Church in Memphis, came home about a half an hour later. Shortly thereafter, Daniels pulled out a gun and shot the man multiple times in the head and torso, repeatedly shouting, "You broke my heart," according to the resulting police report. The armed woman then shot Tabitha in the shoulder after she'd knelt down beside her husband. Collierville police officers arrived at the scene at about 10:30 p.m., at which point they reportedly ordered Daniels to drop her weapon. When she refused to comply, she was shot with a beanbag shotgun and taken into police custody. The two victims were taken to Regional One Health Medical Center in Memphis, where Broads succumbed to his injuries the following morning. Tabitha ultimately survived the incident and was released from the hospital within a few days. Daniels, a social worker from Little Rock, was consequently charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, assault on a police officer, escape, and resisting arrest. Number 5. Nicole Berry. Englishwoman Nicole Berry spent a night out with her boyfriend in March of 2019 in order to celebrate her new job as a mental health social worker at a psychiatric unit in the Greater Manchester area. After going to a restaurant in the city centre, Berry's partner, later named as Justin Henry, reportedly bought her bottles of vodka as a congratulatory gift. Then in the early hours of the following morning, the couple got into an altercation with an individual at the Revolution Bar in the Deansgate Locks district. While waiting for a taxi to drive them home, Henry began arguing with Paul Dan, who was reportedly with around 12 other people, celebrating one of the group members' 21st birthday. Henry allegedly called Dan a derogatory name, at which point the two got into each other's faces, threatening violence. Dan pushed the man to the ground, and he was then punched and kicked repeatedly repeatedly by several members of the other group. Upon witnessing her boyfriend under attack, 25-year-old Berry reportedly took the 2 bottles of vodka she'd been given and smashed them over Dan's head. Blood began pouring from the latter's scalp, and he was ultimately taken to a nearby hospital for treatment. Although he was discharged shortly thereafter, Dan later revealed that he began suffering from regular migraine headaches in the wake of the incident. Berry was consequently arrested and charged with causing grievous bodily harm. She was also reportedly suspended from her job as a social worker, pending a disciplinary investigation into the matter. Following a trial at Manchester Crown Court, Berry was spared jail time, but she was ordered to complete 100 hours of unpaid community service, 15 rehabilitation requirement days, and a 60-day alcohol monitoring program. Number 4. Alexander Averill. On October 3rd of 2019, officers with the Pitt County Sheriff's Office in North Carolina initiated a traffic stop on a vehicle being operated by Alexander Averill. It was reported that at the time, the 29-year-old man was driving an official government-issued car in his capacity as a social worker with the United States Department of Veteran Affairs. During the course of the traffic stop, officers found illegal substances and drug paraphernalia in the vehicle, and the man was thus taken into custody on possession charges. Averill's arrest marked the culmination of a 4-month joint investigation by the Pitt County Special Operations Unit and the VA's Office of the Inspector General. The official probe had been set into motion after officials began to suspect that the social worker had been using government time and the government vehicle to possess and transport illegal narcotics, a suspicion proven to be correct by the events of October the 3rd. 2 months later, investigators determined that Averill had also been using his government-issued car for personal use and had driven it to several unauthorized locations in North Carolina and Virginia. He consequently faced 7 felony counts of embezzlement, in addition to the drug possession charges. Number 3. Chelsea Gray. In an Associated Press article published on April the 9th of 2019, it was reported that Iowa social worker Chelsea Gray had been taken into police custody for delivering false testimony before a judge. 34-year-old Gray, a Lawler resident, had reportedly been assigned as the case manager when the Department of Human Services sought to remove 4 northern Iowa children from their biological parents for reasons that were left unreported. As case manager, the woman was tasked with providing social services to both the children and their parents, as well as evaluating any potential mental health or substance abuse issues, among other duties. Following a court hearing on the case, Judge Greg Rosenblatt ruled that the parents involved be stripped of their rights. He credited Gray's testimony, in which she recommended that the children be placed in foster care, as being credible, unbiased, and persuasive. However, it later emerged that the social worker had allegedly committed perjury. According to affidavits signed by the Division of Criminal Investigation, Gray falsely testified that she'd spoken directly with the children's teachers about academic and social concerns at school. She also reportedly claimed to have visited the kids at least once per month per Iowa code, which was also determined to have been untrue. Upon her arrest, she was formally charged with 3 counts of perjury and booked at the Cerro Gordo County Jail in Mason City. In October of 2019, Gray entered an Alford plea, accepting the punishment associated with her charges while officially maintaining her innocence. She was consequently sentenced to 730 days of probation and ordered to pay a $750 civil penalty. Today's topic was requested by Instagram followers Kaylee Wilson 49 and Larchmont 30. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comment section below, or follow us on Instagram and reach out to us there. Number 2. Samantha Hammer. Wisconsin State Senator Tim Carpenter was attacked during the chaotic protests and riots that unfolded on the streets of downtown Madison on June the 23rd of 2020. During the course of the night, rioters toppled statues erected outside the state capitol, damaged the Capitol building itself, and even tossed a Molotov cocktail into a county building that housed the 911 dispatch center. 60-year-old Carpenter began filming the group's destructive behavior with his cell phone, prompting them to approach him. In the video footage captured by the senator, 2 women were shown charging towards him and grabbing his phone. Carpenter was then punched and kicked multiple times by 8 to 10 people, resulting in him reportedly suffering a broken nose and a concussion. Following a month-long investigation by Madison police, the women in the video were identified as 26-year-old Samantha Hammer and Karida O'Reilly, aged 33. The former, a social worker for the Mount Horeb School District, turned herself into the authorities in July of 2020. As did O'Reilly. Hammer was suspended from her position without pay following the incident, and both suspects were charged with felony substantial battery as a party to a crime. Following their trial, O'Reilly was ultimately acquitted of the offense, while Hammer accepted a plea deal that lessened her charge to disorderly conduct. Number 1. Robert Riley Saunders. From 2001 to 2018, Canadian man Robert Riley Saunders served as a social worker for British Columbia's Ministry of Children and Family Development. The organization first began to detect financial irregularities involving Saunders in 2017, prompting an official investigation into the matter by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Saunders was ultimately terminated from his position in 2018, and about 2 years later, investigators wrapped up their probe into his financial dealings during his tenure as a government worker. It was determined that the man had defrauded at least 102 of his former clients, 85 of whom were identified as Indigenous youth. As was detailed in more than a dozen civil lawsuits filed by the victims, Saunders had moved many of his clients out of stable homes and into independent living situations, after which he would set up joint bank accounts to siphon money from them that had originally been provided by the ministry. In total, the man had misappropriated more than $460,000 from the teens entrusted to his care, and several of the victims claimed to have been left homeless as a consequence of the fraud. It subsequently emerged that Saunders had falsified his professional qualifications prior to being hired by the ministry back in 1996. Court records indicated that he'd actually used a fake Bachelor of Social Work degree, purportedly from the University of Manitoba, as part of his original employment applications. The ministry ultimately reached a multi-million-dollar settlement agreement with the social workers' victims that awarded each of them between $25,000 and $250,000. In July of 2022, the CBC reported that Saunders, who faced criminal charges of fraud, breach of trust, and forgery, had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for his elaborate scheme. Number 7. Jennifer Hall. In the spring of 2022, a former hospital worker was arrested roughly 20 years after allegedly administering a fatal dose of medication to a patient at Hedrick Medical Center in Livingston, Missouri, while Jennifer Hall worked as a respiratory therapist at the rural health care facility. From December of 2001 to May of 2002, there was an alarming increase of code blue patients who'd gone into cardiac arrest under suspicious circumstances. Of the 18 to have suffered sudden complications, 9 passed away, including 75-year-old Fern Franco. A wrongful death suit was subsequently filed by the families of 5 victims against the hospital, but the Missouri Supreme Court ultimately dismissed it, arguing that the statute of limitations had run out. The hospital, which was accused of covering up the incidents, fired Hall in 2002, a few days after the death of Fern Franco. Her termination was officially motivated by a past arson conviction, as she'd been accused of starting a fire at a previous hospital where she'd worked, and was out on appeal at the time of her employment at Hedrick. Hall was eventually acquitted of arson at a retrial after spending a year in prison. In the aftermath of Hall's termination, the code blue patients at Hedrick returned to historical frequency. An investigation was reopened into the suspicious deaths after it emerged that Franco had substances in her system that hadn't been prescribed by her doctor. The woman, who'd been hospitalized for pneumonia, had been injected with lethal doses of succinylcholine, a relaxant that paralyzes the respiratory muscles, and morphine. She fatally suffocated while still conscious. Nearly 2 decades later, Hall was charged with first-degree murder for the incident, but the authorities didn't disclose a potential motive or whether she'd face further charges as of the latest updates. Number 6. Aisha Basharat. On January the 24th of 2021, a hospital worker was caught on CCTV
purchasing various items from a vending machine while using the bank card of an elderly patient minutes after she'd passed away. 23-year-old Aisha Basharat was at the time working in the COVID ward at Birmingham's Heartlands Hospital in England. An unnamed 83-year-old succumbed to her condition at 1:56 p.m. Within 17 minutes, Basharat was recorded making several contactless purchases from a vending machine. Upon returning to work on January the 28th, Basharat tried using the card once more, but by then it had been cancelled. The worker was arrested during her shift and initially claimed to have found the dead woman's card on the floor and that it had somehow gotten mixed up with her own possessions. It was revealed, however, that the cards were of different color and that Basharat had blatantly ignored the protocols regarding lost patient property. She went on to admit theft and fraud by false representation, for which she was given 5 months in prison, suspended for 18 months. Number 5. Warriran Lee. A 44-year-old hospital theatre support worker was jailed for 2 years and 3 months in 2022 after being found guilty of gradually stealing the savings of a disabled pensioner. Warriran Lee befriended Gerald Beach in 2006 while delivering his meals at his retirement housing complex in Aylesford, England. She went on to unofficially care for him for roughly 12 years, a time period during which the man's family claimed she took over one of his bank accounts and made withdrawals without his permission. As 83-year-old Beach, who suffered serious mobility problems, later told the authorities he'd allowed Lee to use his Nationwide account for various expenses. She was not, however, given permission to use his Lloyd's account, which the pensioner kept for rainy days. The woman somehow managed to obtain the PIN and made withdrawals at will, reportedly using the money during various trips abroad and to buy gifts for her family. A fellow retiree noted that Lee had a hold on Beach, and she informed social services that the caregiver was locking him in his home. As an official inquest commenced, the man discovered his Lloyd's account was virtually empty, holding less than $10. Between August of 2016 and June of 2018, Lee was accused of taking roughly $15,000 from him. She denied theft in court but was ultimately found guilty in April of 2022. Number 4. Stacey Hayes. Just before midnight on October the 4th of 2021, a nurse at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia gunned down a co-worker. 55-year-old Stacey Hayes emerged from an 8th-floor elevator carrying a handgun and ambushed Ann Ray James from behind as he sat at his workstation. 43-year-old James succumbed to multiple gunshot injuries in a local hospital. While wearing body armor over his scrubs, Hayes drove several miles in a U-Haul before he got out of his vehicle and discharged an AR-15 into the air. Law enforcement responded to reports of gunfire and that an armed man in scrubs was in the area. They found Hayes at the School of the Future at 40th and Parkside, where the hospital worker engaged them in a shootout, letting off at least 69 shots from his assault rifle. Arsenio Perez, one of the 2 officers injured in the fire exchange, was subsequently told he might never fully regain the use of his right forearm. Hayes was critically shot in the neck and upper body during the shootout, but he eventually recovered to face justice for his crimes. He pleaded guilty to charges including third-degree murder and in August of 2022 was sentenced to at least 35 years in prison, which, given his age, was likely a life sentence. Even though law enforcement believed James's killing had been targeted, no concrete motive was provided for Hayes' actions. During sentencing, he only spoke to express remorse for his crimes. There was speculation that the man's actions had somehow been linked to an earlier confiscation of the small arsenal he owned. Prior to the rampage, the Philadelphia police had confiscated a 12-gauge shotgun with 12 rounds, a Panther AR-15 rifle, and a Smith & Wesson pistol with 3 magazines and 39 rounds from Hayes. Under unspecified circumstances, he petitioned a judge for the return of his firearms, arguing that they'd been purchased legally and that he wasn't a threat. The guns were handed back to him in June, and within months, Hayes went on the shooting spree. Number 3. Nicole Lorraine Linton. While working as a traveling registered nurse, 37-year-old Texas woman Nicole Lorraine Linton caused a horrific traffic accident on August the 4th of 2022 as she sped through a Los Angeles intersection. Even though a light had turned red for an estimated 9 seconds, Linton barreled through passing traffic in Windsor Hills. She smashed her Mercedes into several cars at up to 90 miles per hour. A harrowing video of the crash was picked up by multiple media outlets and showed Linton essentially cutting through other motorists. 5 people died in the fiery wreck, including a woman who was 8 months pregnant. Linton, who was living and working in LA at the time, survived and was subsequently charged with 6 counts of murder and 5 of vehicular manslaughter. Court documents obtained by the Los Angeles Times detailed that the woman suffered from severe mental health issues, which had begun to manifest in May of 2018 while she was studying nursing at the University of Houston, Texas. That month, in the midst of a panic attack, she began running through her neighborhood before eventually slamming herself against the hood of a police cruiser. She was arrested for disorderly conduct and, in the days that followed, told her family she was possessed by her dead grandmother. Linton was checked into a psychiatric hospital and diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Further incidents in the years that followed came to include self-harming behavior, a naked rampage through her neighborhood, and leaping from windows. In the hours leading up to the crash, she'd called her sister displaying similarly erratic behavior. After going home from work to have lunch, Linton FaceTimed the woman while fully nude and told her that hospital co-workers were acting weird. She returned to work and minutes before the crash called her sister to say that she was going back to Houston to get married and that she should meet her at the altar. As of early September 2022, Linton was held without bail while her mental health was further examined. Her defense argued that she should be placed in a mental health institution, claiming that a psychotic break had rendered her in an unconscious state at the time of the crash. Today's topic was requested by Adrian Woodhouse. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. William George Davis. In 2017 and 2018, multiple patients at the Christus Trinity Mother Frances Hospital in Tyler, Texas, started experiencing unexplained complications while they were recovering from heart surgery. As they examined their CT scans, doctors found that the patients had air in their brains. An investigation subsequently connected the suspicious deaths to former nurse William George Davis. In April of 2018, about a month after he'd been fired from the medical facility, the 34-year-old was arrested. He was the only employee consistently around each of the patients, and surveillance video showed him entering and leaving their rooms moments before they experienced stroke-like symptoms. Davis was accused of injecting air into the catheters of roughly 11 recovering patients, 6 of which passed away. While some of the deaths were harder to prove, he was ultimately convicted of 4: John Lafferty, Ronald Clark, Christopher Greenaway, and Joseph Kalina. During his trial, Davis's defense tried to argue that the hospital was making him a scapegoat, simply because he'd been around each person at the time of their death. However, the prosecution maintained that the incidents weren't accidental. As evidence, they presented the recording of a jailhouse call between Davis and his ex-wife, in which he'd claimed that he wanted to lengthen the time that patients spent in the ICU so that he could earn more overtime. The jury only deliberated for 2 hours before sentencing the former nurse to death on October the 27th of 2021. The decision was automatically appealed. Number 1. David Fuller. In 1987, 2 women were murdered several months apart in Royal Tunbridge Wells, England, in a case that subsequently went cold for roughly 33 years. Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, aged 25 and 20 respectively, met their end in similarly gruesome fashion as both had been beaten, abused, and strangled to death. Nell was killed on June the 23rd, and her body was found by her boyfriend inside her bedsit after she'd failed to turn up for work. Evidence indicated that she'd been assaulted either as she was dying or after her death. Pierce was abducted from outside her Grosvenor Park bedsit on November the 24th, and her lifeless body was found in a remote location 40 miles away 3 weeks later. The investigation into the incidents, which would come to be known as the bedsit murders, saw little progress until 2007. That's when a review of DNA evidence collected from both crime scenes revealed that they'd been carried out by the same unidentified perpetrator. Then in 2020, a DNA match linked the Nell and Pierce murders to David Fuller, a local electrician in his late 60s. He was arrested, and a search of his home revealed further disturbing crimes. Law enforcement found several hard drives containing numerous photos and videos that showed Fuller abusing over 100 female corpses in hospital mortuaries. The desecrations were carried out while he'd worked as a hospital electrician from 2008 to 2020 at the Kenton Sussex Hospital and the Tunbridge Wells Hospital. He pleaded guilty to the charges stemming from the corpse abuse prior to the trial for the murders of Nell and Pierce. While initially chasing a plea of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, he eventually pleaded guilty to the double murder on November the 4th of 2021. Fuller was given a whole life sentence with a concurrent 12-year term for his desecration crimes, upon which the sentencing judge commented, telling him, "You became a vulture, picking your victims from among the dead." Thanks for watching. Would you rather be treated by a drunk dentist or ride with a drunk Uber driver? Let us know in the comments section below.